Story time with Stephanie Story.
Hi, I am Stephanie Storey, art historical novelist. Welcome to my show, Story Time. Today's guest, he is a writer also from my hometown of Hot Springs, Arkansas, although I have to say we've never met, so this is the first time right here. He's moved up, he now writes out of New York, and his first book, it's nonfiction, it's called The Vapors, A Southern Family, the New York Mob, and the Rise and Fall of Hot Springs, America's Forgotten Capital of Ice. Welcome to the show, David Hill.
It's quite a mouthful, right? Thanks for having me. It's really nice to be on your show.
So as somebody from Hot Springs, this was a fascinating read. But I also want to get to why it would be a fascinating read for anybody outside of here too. But first, I've read it, but people always butcher other people's books. Tell the people at home what you think your book is about, and then I'll ask my own questions.
Okay. Well, this book follows the lives of three people from about the early 1930s to the into the 1960s. And those three people are Oni Madden, who was a important kind of organized crime figure, one of the three top beer barons of New York during Prohibition, who comes to Hot Springs after he gets out of prison for murder and ends up staying there the rest of his life. Dane Harris, who's a local guy, the son of a Cherokee bootlegger who kind of rises up the ranks of the economic and gambling establishments in Hot Springs to kind of become the boss of the town. And Hazel Hill, who's my grandmother, who comes to Hot Springs as a teenager in the early 30s and sticks around and kind of works in a lot of these gambling clubs and on the margins of the gambling business her whole life. And through those three people's lives during that sort of almost 40-year span, it tells the story of this place, Hot Springs, Arkansas, which was that entire period of time the largest illegal gambling operation in America, and was really kind of the America's gambling capital before Las Vegas was Las Vegas. And for at least a brief window was sort of in the running to be Las Vegas.
So I was sort of struck by how it does feel like, in a strange way, a microcosm of American history. What do you feel like people from outside of this area will take from it, storytelling or knowledge-wise or perspective-wise, on American history more broadly?
Well, I think in some ways the stories that I tell in The Vapors are stories that people have largely heard before. It's just that they've never heard them quite this way. I mean, you know, there have been a lot of books written about organized crime. There have been a lot of books written about, you know, the mob and how the mob sort of corrupts communities and takes control of cities and wield power. And a lot of the figures in the book that I write about, there've been whole books and movies made about those people before. And there's likewise been stories that have been written about, you know, maybe the civil rights movement. There've been books written about, you know, people have told story of, you know, mid-century America has been done to death, right? That's the baby boomers generation, and they've certainly given us plenty of history of what all went on there. I think what makes this story unique is that it happens in this small town in the Bible Belt in the deep South. And so I think that's what makes it novel to people. It's kind of like a cast of characters and kind of a bunch of sort of themes and stories that people feel like they've heard before, but it's set in this strange place, you know, surrounded by like Pentecostal preachers and doing, you know, speaking in tongues, and like it's set in the middle of the country in the South, you know, and I think that's what makes it different. And I think that's what draws people to it. Is it's almost like a fresh take on an old story, and it's real, it's true. So again, you know, I think it surprises people who maybe think they've heard it all when it comes to the mob, or they think they've heard it all when it comes to, you know, telling the stories of the broader themes of mid-century Americana, and then they find this one that they didn't know about. And so I just think that it's adding something new to the canon that's, you know, that hasn't been done a lot before. Because I mean, honestly, it's just weird that nobody's written this book before, right? It's weird that this story hadn't been told this way before. And so the folks that don't really who are listening to this, who maybe have no idea what we're talking about, I mean, Hot Springs was bringing in 5 million people plus a year. there was hundreds of millions of dollars in profits being made just from the gambling alone. I mean, Hot Springs was a city on the move. They were building, massive hotels, thousands and thousands of rooms. They were building a gigantic convention center. There was a sense that Hot Springs would legalize gambling. And this is kind of when Las Vegas, people weren't sure about. From 57 to 1960, there was a lot written about how Las Vegas was a bust, right? That it was ridiculous anybody could ever even imagine that you should invest in real estate and to try to develop a resort in Las Vegas. And places were going bankrupt left and right. So it felt at that time like Las Vegas was a failure. And Hot Springs had an opportunity to legalize gambling, and Arkansas had an opportunity to legalize gambling in Hot Springs. And if they had, Hot Springs likely would have been the recipient of many, many millions of dollars in Teamster loans to build casinos in Arkansas rather than in Nevada. And so, in anticipation of this, there was a huge boom. I mean, a huge building boom. People were moving there. Hot Springs really exploded. So from the year 60 to 65, Hot Springs was exploding in growth, and there was tons of money being made, and it was really a city on the rise. And then it wasn't. And and then it started to kind of tick downward, and it ticked downward for the next maybe 30 years. That's what I mean by the rise and fall. I mean, this was like, that was a small window in the city's history, but it was a fascinating one because it was a window in which anything was possible. And the people that lived in this city were really allowing themselves to imagine that there was no end to how big this could get, and that they were all going to get phenomenally wealthy, and that Hot Springs was going to become a world-class city. And that may sound foolish now, but like the same people who had that dream in Las Vegas, it worked. They pulled it off in a place that was so unlikely, far less likely that it could have ever happened there than Hot Springs. And so in some ways, this is the story of Hot Springs is a bit tragic, because if not for a couple of votes in the state legislature, it probably would have been Hot Springs that would have become, a million person plus, kind of international tourist destination.
It is wild to think about what this city could have been, because we are, for people at home who are not here, we're in the middle of a bit of nowhere.
Las Vegas is in the middle of nowhere. I mean, Hot Springs is somewhere. I mean, Hot Springs is in the middle. Hot Springs already was getting millions of visitors prior to this. So, if it was 1955 and you were standing in Las Vegas, Nevada, you'd say, yeah, nothing's ever going to happen here. But if you went to Hot Springs in 1955, you could see it, you could imagine it. But now we look at Las Vegas and Hot Springs from 2020 looking back, and it seems impossible. But it actually makes more logical sense that, that Hot Springs could have been Havana, Hot Springs could have been Monte Carlo. Las Vegas was really nothing. There was no electricity. There was no sewer system. There was no water. They had to create which makes that story all the more remarkable. It is a remarkable story that they were able to build that city in the middle of that desert. But it's not so wild to think that it could have been Hot Springs.
Well, it is so funny because I don't know about you. I was born in the mid 70s here in Hot Springs. I have a feeling we're around the same ballpark. And for me, the town still had like a hangover from this. Like when I was growing up, I still sort of knew about all the gambling and all of this. It was sort of had this reputation as being like an eccentric, artsy town when I was little, and that has slowly changed.
Yeah.
And that sort of, did you have the same, I felt like it was a big city. I felt like I was from a big city when I grew up here, because in Arkansas it is, and I thought it was really eccentric. Is that the same town you had a vision of? And then how have you seen it change?
Well, I think growing up there, and I was born in the late 70s, growing up there in the 1980s, I definitely felt like Hot Springs was eccentric. I definitely had that sense of it, but not because it was necessarily like a kind of a fun or funky place. I feel like it was, in some ways, it was eccentric because it was incredibly poor. But yet there was these sort of relics, all of the relics of the bygone days were all around us. So like it felt weird to be in a city that had these massive buildings, these gigantic luxury hotels that were closed and I'd never seen open, right? Or like all these elegant buildings up and down downtown that held like gift shops or wax museums or whatever. And I think Hot Springs just really struggled to find its footing. I mean, it couldn't figure out how to continue to be a tourist town and a resort community post gambling. And I think a lot of people fled hot springs after gambling as well, which left very few people to kind of keep the wheels turning. So, but I also remember in the 1980s that there were like 7 strip clubs in Hot Springs, even though there were like 25,000 people. So, it was just a very strange place. I think it was a city that was really in search of an identity, and it kept looking for one because its identity was taken away from it very abruptly, right? I mean, I don't get into this so much in the book because the book kind of had to end, but gambling kind of sputters along for a while after it's officially shut down, and they keep trying to run clubs, on the sneak, and then those are getting shut down. And so there was a bit of this like kind of underground gambling that went on through the 1970s, where a lot of these former like leaders of the town were now trying to run casinos out of their lake houses or in the back in back rooms, and in addition to that, there was a whole carnival community that showed up in Hot Springs because of the gambling that was really based out of there. And so even through the 1970s, the kind of carnival community had it had a reputation of being, there were a lot of characters in the carnival community that were, some of them were less than honest, let's say, and that that world kind of also existed in Hot Springs through the 70s and into the 1980s. And Hot Springs, I think, and what Arkansas desperately wanted it to be, because it was a national park and it was still receiving tourists, was they wanted it to be a family resort, a family destination. They wanted it to be kind of like a Branson or something. They wanted it to be where it could be in keeping with the rest of Arkansas's kind of like, I don't know, pious, like, vibe or whatever. But it didn't really take. I mean, that's not how it worked. And the tourists that were coming to the horse races every year. It was still gamblers that were coming year after year through the 1980s. And so I just think that Hot Springs was in a real crisis, identity crisis, for a long, long time. And I think it was in an economic crisis because they had lost the bedrock of their economy. So yeah, I grew up when I was growing up in Hot Springs, I definitely felt like Hot Springs was I think that was its nadir, really. I think Hot Springs is really, you're there now, but it's really come a long, long way from there. And it's a great place now. And it's really found its footing, and it's found an identity that I think really works for Hot Springs. And it's done such a great job, but it took like 15, 20 years, maybe more, to kind of get its sea legs back after gambling got snatched away.
Okay, I'm not giving anything away because you just talked about this. So obviously the gambling has to come to an end at the end of this book, basically. And there's a particular date, even though, as you said, it sort of sputters along after that. Okay. I was thinking about it when I was finishing it up. I think I was finishing it up yesterday, right before we talked. And I was thinking about, oh my gosh, this feels like the day before like the lockdown over the pandemic, where everybody's like rushing out. Oh my gosh, let's enjoy the moment. And then it does all go away and the economy suddenly shifts. Mm-hmm. And I was sort of looking ahead in our own sort of national history after the pandemic is over and thinking about the kinds of impacts it's going to have. Have you had any of those sort of mental connections between that change of economy in Hot Springs and this pandemic? Am I making it up? Have you had any insight into any of this that this research gave you?
Well, I think that like a lot of the people who were really going, a lot of the families that got really wealthy off of gambling in the 1960s, once gambling was gone, they had to really reinvent, and figure out how they were going to, make their way in the world. And different families found different ways, right? I mean, some went into the hotel business, some went into real estate because they kind of had bought a lot of real estate they were able to sell. Some went into things like pawn shops, bail bonds. It was the families that I think controlled a lot of gambling, and that was their business, had to figure out something else to do. And for all of the people that worked in these clubs, that was how they made their livelihood. A lot of them just had to leave. I mean, there were a lot of folks that just came to Hot Springs seasonally. The city would really kind of double in population during the race meet. And so that also kind of started to dwindle over the years. So I don't know that there was this, there is a scene in the book. So the night before that everyone kind of gets word that the governor's going to shut it down on Easter, the night before they kind of have a big party and everybody shows up to have the last hurrah. That's true. But then it does keep going after that in sort of a smaller ways. It gets smaller and smaller each year. So I don't think it was so sudden, but it did happen, right? And it happened gradually over the next maybe 5 to 10 years, And during that 5 to 10 years, things just got worse and worse and worse.
There is that racial element in here about the number of Black workers who came to work in the bathhouses and the casinos and because for people at home who we haven't really talked about the fact that this is also a town of hot springs, by the way, and bathhouses and the actual physical hot springs that come up in the water that sort of has fed the city for a long time. You may not have an answer to this, and if you don't, that's fine, but did looking at the racial history of this town in any way give you any different perspective on the current energy behind the Black Lives Matter movement? I don't know. Did the racial history of this small southern town give you any insight into our bigger, broader history and struggles with this issue? The big question, sorry.
No, I mean, I think it does. I think that there's a lesson to be learned in looking at the uniqueness of the of how Hot Springs, of the sort of the relationship between the white community and the Black community in Hot Springs during this period of time. You know, I write in the book about how Hot Springs is a relatively progressive community. You know, it's relative to the rest of Arkansas. I mean, Hot Springs was still segregated. This is still the segregated in Jim Crow South. So, you know, there's no reason to pat anybody on the back. I think that a lot of that progressiveness was through pure, you know, political utility. I mean, you know, Hot Springs depended on the votes of African Americans in order to keep certain political factions in power and keep others at bay, which meant that there was a real, you know, they encouraged African Americans to turn out and vote. They courted the vote. They worked really hard to make sure that everybody voted. And this is during a time when in the rest of the state of Arkansas, Black people were discouraged from voting, right? They were turned away at the polls. They were given poll tests and poll taxes and things like that and intimidated and told not to vote. So in that sense, you know, you could see it as progressive, but that's because it was a necessity. It was needed. You know, it had political utility that helped the white folks stay in power. What you also see in the book is that every time there's a need to like offer the governor or offer the law enforcement a sacrificial lamb, they offer up a Black run club. You know what I mean? Like when they've got to close somebody down, they go to the Harlem Chicken Shack and bust in the doors and take their slot machines away. So they were real quick to throw those folks under the bus too. But I think that, you know, there's always been a sort of a line in Hot Springs, if you're from there, that like that the civil rights movement didn't really, you know, come to Hot Springs. It didn't touch Hot Springs, right? That there was never any kind of racial strife or animosity, which isn't necessarily true. And I talk a little bit in the book about James Rice, who was a civil rights leader who comes to Hot Springs to run this church, the Roanoke Baptist Church, and he is he sort of leads a movement around town to integrate public spaces and integrate the bathhouses and largely he's successful, and there isn't any real pushback from the police or the government in Hot Springs, but there is, you know, some tension in that he's pressing for this. But in the end, they end up burning his church down. There's some evidence that, you know, that the church was burned down as part of a conspiracy to, like, you know, as part of the gambling wars that went on. But it was burned down at the same time that Black churches were being burned and bombed all over the South as retribution for the civil rights movement as well. The Roanoke church fire was called arson by the local police because the local police did not want the FBI to come to town to investigate it, because if the FBI come to Hot Springs, they're going to check in on the gambling. And I even talk in the book about how even the Black-run newspaper in Arkansas, the Arkansas Citizen, wrote an op-ed saying, we don't want the FBI here. We don't want James Rice to call the FBI. Let's just call it arson. We know it's not arson. It's clearly not arson, but let's just move on because we don't need the FBI in Hot Springs because they'll shut down the gambling and we all need that, right? So a very strange dynamic and a very weird kind of relationship that went on. But again, everything that happened in Hot Springs, everything was tied somehow to gambling and tied to this delicate balance that went on between the, you know, this kind of complete and comprehensive political corruption that was required to keep gambling going, that everybody was in on, from the churches to the, you know, to the schools, to, you know, everybody in the community had to be in on this and a part of it, and everybody went along with it. And so that created a lot of strange dynamics and a lot of strange relationships, right? And so the relationship between the white side of town and the Black side of town was also a very strange one. And once gambling was gone, that relationship went right down the tubes. And so in the 1970s, that's when we see and this isn't in the book, and so I'm just getting into Hot Springs history or whatever, but in the 1970s is when they begin the organization Coalition for the Liberation of Blacks, and there are a number of demonstrations. There's protests. There's a riot at one point. So through the 1970s, things got really tense between the white and the black community in Hot Springs. So there's also in that, I think there's evidence that shows that as long as gambling was there and there was that political utility, it also created some kind of balance of peace between those two communities at a time and in a state where there was absolutely no peace, where everything was completely fraught and there was tons of violence. So Hot Springs was able to operate in a different space, at least while gambling was going.
So I, like you, I'm from Hot Springs. Your cousin lives right there. Like, I can see his house from here. Your other cousin is my doctor when we're here. Like, it is a small town, right? And it is a fascinating town with a fascinating history that I have known since I was a kid. My parents are together because my mom's family came down here because her parents were these gamblers. They came down here from Southern Illinois to be a part of this culture. That's the reason why I exist.
Mm-hmm.
I understand it's a fascinating history. But I have to say, when I left to go to college and I moved out to LA and I produced TV for 15, 20 years in LA and New York, I did not care to come back and write a book about Hot Springs. What is it that after you left and after you went to New York, even though you're not here, kept you personally so obsessed to need to come back to tell this story for you personally? Then I'll ask about other people.
Well, I came to writing kind of late in life, and when I started writing, I was writing about sports, and I ended up writing about gambling just because it was kind of it was like a beat nobody else was on, like it was easy for me to get stories. It was easy for me to land stories that were about gambling or, topics that around that kind of world that nobody else really knew much about, that I knew a lot about because of where I was from and the family that I come from. And one of the stories I wrote early on in my career was about Hot Springs and touched on some of this history. And I wrote that for ESPN, and it piqued a lot of people's curiosity. I mean, I got a lot of questions from folks. I mean, people were very interested to learn more about Hot Springs. It really surprised people that this was true, that this place was real, that it existed, and that nobody had ever heard of it before. And so I think that's when I realized that that there might be, that I could go back to this well, that this was a story that needed to be told, because I think living in Hot Springs, growing up there, I took for granted how I don't think I fully understood how little people really knew about what went on there. And so, getting away from Hot Springs, getting some distance, I think I had a better appreciation for the fact that history was not only going to be fascinating to people, but that there'd actually be an appetite for it, since nobody'd really told it in a kind of a popular way before.
Okay, I understand that you learned a lot about your own family history by doing this because your grandmother is central in the story, right? She's one of the main point of view characters. So I get all of that. Did you learn anything about yourself? Because I felt like I learned something about myself just reading it. So did you learn anything about your own perspective on the world by researching this and writing this?
Yeah, I did. I think I learned a lot about myself. I think that's, natural when writing a book, probably, especially writing family history. In learning about my relatives, particularly my father and my grandmother, I think that I learned more about why they made choices they did and why they sort of lived the lives they did and why they kind of were, had the lot in life that they had. And that informed kind of how I would think about myself and how I would, it definitely changed my perception of myself and my place in my family, et cetera. But also I think when I set out to write this book, I thought that I came away from the story and from the experience of writing the book with a far more critical eye towards gambling, the gambling business in Hot Springs, than I thought I would. I mean, I thought I was really going to just celebrate it. I thought that this was something that was good, was objectively good for Hot Springs, and that it was like obvious that it was a missed opportunity for the city to become something, to become like I said before, like a world-class city. And I came away from the book realizing that it's not so cut and dry, and that there is an actual social cost that's paid by, having a community that's only sort of, that the only business in that community is vice. And that's not to be judgmental about vice and the people who choose to partake in it. It's that when that's what the sort of community completely depends on, it does mean that, you know, you also have to depend on some fairly unsavory characters to keep propping that up. It relied on political corruption, it relied on violence, it relied on, you know, it relied on people's on sort of exploiting people's dreams, and, you know, kind of taking advantage of people. I mean, so all of those things are all objectively bad. So I felt like, you know, given that, even though the gambling business created a lot of money for Hot Springs and for the economy to allow it to sort of grow, you know, it came at a cost. And I think I really learned the full picture of that, you know, learning about my grandmother and her life. And so I was glad in the end to get to include that. I don't think that I originally set out to include Hazel as a character because I wanted a kind of a personal entry into the book. But in the end, I think that she provides a really well needed, you know, ballast for the book to show folks that, like, it's not just about the rich and powerful people that, you know, kind of pull all the levers and make all the decisions that make history. It's also about the people that, you know, sweep the floors and carry the trays and dealt the cards in their lives, and how their lives were impacted by those choices that kind of the rich and powerful people made. And so in the end, I was glad that I was able to tell the story that way.
So one is, you talked about that you came away from this book wondering, questioning the vice or the positiveness that sort of I've always lived with living here, of that gambling era.
Mhm.
And for people who aren't from here, the racetrack's still here, Oaklawn's still here, and now there's a casino that's coming back. Is
Right.
it going to bring? I mean, is it going to? I mean, it's going to have to be a completely different world than it was, as it used to be. For people who don't know, again, I don't know if we really said this. Gambling was illegal. This was all like open illegal, but it was technically illegal. This is technically legal, but is this just trying to bring back that era? Do you have a thought on the new casino?
Well, yeah, I mean, the new casino is just a way to bring in some tax revenue for the state of Arkansas. And so in a lot of ways, it's a day late and a dollar short. I mean, we now have legal casino gambling in over 40 states in the United States, right? So this is, you know, this is a done deal now. I mean, gambling for all intents and purposes is now legal in the United States. So this battle that was waged at Hot Springs to try to legalize it or not was just, you know, it was waged in a different time when there was only legal gambling in Nevada. And, you know, if obviously, you know, if they had passed it in Arkansas and when they had in Arkansas, this would have been, you know, it would have been to Nevada's great detriment, because people would have opted to come visit Arkansas rather than Nevada, because it was a much more hospitable place. I mean, it wasn't in the middle of a damn desert, you know, it was a place where, you know, it was actually quite beautiful and people were already used to coming here. But legalizing it now is, you know, it's almost like Arkansas also was one of the last states to come up with a lottery, right? And when they finally gave in and developed the lottery, and they realized the amount of tax revenue that brought in, extra tax revenue to the state that I think was looking for it, then it was just a matter of time before casino gambling was going to go. And it was a statewide referendum, which I think is interesting, because Hot Springs civic leaders tried, I think, 4 or 5 times from the 1960s up until that vote in 2016 that passed. They kept trying to get the state of Arkansas to pass it through ballot initiatives, and it failed every single time. You know, the state of Arkansas was just not going to do it until the lottery, and I think that was kind of the domino or whatever. But it's too late. I mean, it's not going to be the same. You know, if they had legalized gambling in the 1960s, we would have seen such a massive amount of economic development, and all those hotels that we see that are empty in Hot Springs were built in anticipation of legalized gambling. There would have just been more and more and more of those. It would have grown the way we saw Las Vegas grow. Having a casino there today is just offering an extra amenity to people who are already coming to the racetrack, and offering some extra tax dollars to the state. But no, I don't think Hot Springs will ever be what it was in the early 1960s, nor will it ever be what it could have been if they had legalized gambling then. I think that, you know, that's sort of asked and answered, and we have to kind of move on and figure out what Hot Springs is going to be. And it's going, you know, I think Hot Springs still can be, you know, a classic American city, a place that deserves far more visitors than it currently gets, but it won't be because they go back to casino gambling and turned it into kind of a gambling town. There's not going to be any more gambling towns in America.
Okay, but I have to ask you one last thing, because this is your first book, so you have nothing to compare it to.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not really a fair question, because this comes out in the middle of the pandemic. My second one came out on April 7th, so I'm right there with you.
Mm-hmm.
but how's it been to put this out, and how's it? I know you're doing it in the middle of a pandemic, so you're doing a lot of this digital stuff, but
Yeah.
how's it felt to put the baby out into the world?
Well, I mean, it's been positive. I mean, it's a little bit of there's two sides to the coin, right? I mean, it sucks that I am not able to leave my basement and go to like bookstores and read and sign people's books and have that experience that I think every author looks forward to. It sucks that I don't have that, and it also sucks that there aren't bookstores open around America, so people aren't able to like walk into a bookstore and see the Vapors laying on the table and buy it. That's also, I think, that's hurting all of us. That's hurting all writers who have books out. But it's been cool that like by being able to do these kind of online events, I've been able to do more than I probably would have if I was, physically traveling to them. So, and I've been able to talk to more people maybe. I mean, when I did the event for the Six Bridges Book Festival, there was like, 500 or 600 people watching, and that there probably wouldn't have been that many people in the room, if I was actually there in a room giving that talk. So, it's a little bit of good and a little bit of bad, but the reception's been really great. I mean, this weekend it's in the New Yorker, it's in New York Times Book Review. And I mean, I never would have imagined all of that. I think it's very cool that I wrote this book always assuming that people in Arkansas would be very interested in it, and that it would find an audience in Arkansas for sure, and people who knew something about Arkansas. And I've been pleasantly surprised to find that there's actually been an audience for it outside of the state of Arkansas. There's been a much broader audience for it, and that people all over the country are interested in it and are enjoying it. And so, I've been very pleased. It's been cool.
Thank you for a beautiful book. It was so much fun to read, and it was so much fun to have this history illuminated. Like you said, it could have been lost, and it was just fantastic. So thank you for joining me here and humoring me with my questions. I always appreciate that, and it was nice to actually meet you.
Yeah, it's nice to meet you. It means a lot to me that you liked the book and that you wanted to talk to me. This is very cool, and I appreciate it. It's also it's like kismet that you're there in Hot Springs and you're able to read it while you're actually there.
Right, I'm sitting looking at Lake Hamilton right now. Mm-hmm. And then with your book, so that's fun. Okay, thank you, David. Best of luck out there in the world, and see everybody else next time. Bye-bye.
Stephanie, story time virtually. We've got time and plenty of stories, talking stories in a novel way. Story time with Stephanie, story.